Please, somebody make her stop crying. The frustrated whisper cut through the cabin like a crack in glass. Heads turned. Eyes rolled. A few passengers exchanged exhausted looks before settling back into their seats. But the crying continued. Minute after minute. Relentless. Sharp. Heartbreaking. The sound filled the first-class cabin of Flight 271 from New York to Los Angeles, drowning out the soft hum of the engines and the polite conversations that usually floated through the air at 35,000 feet. 10-month-old Emma Cole had been crying for nearly an hour. Not fussing, not whining, crying with the kind of desperation that made everyone uncomfortable because nobody seemed able to help. Nathan Cole sat in seat 2A, holding his daughter against his shoulder. His expensive navy jacket was wrinkled. His tie had been loosened. Dark circles sat beneath eyes that had not known proper sleep in months. Most people recognized him immediately. Nathan Cole was the billionaire founder of Cole Global Ventures, one of the most successful technology companies in America. Business magazines called him a visionary. Financial networks called him unstoppable. Investors called him brilliant. Yet at that moment, none of those titles mattered, because a crying baby did not care about stock prices or private jets. Emma cried harder. Nathan gently rocked her. He checked her bottle. He offered her a toy. He adjusted the small blanket wrapped around her legs. Nothing worked. The baby pushed the bottle away and buried her face against his chest before another wave of tears escaped. A flight attendant approached with a sympathetic smile. "Can I bring you anything, sir?" Nathan forced a tired smile. "I think if you had the answer, you would already be a billionaire." The attendant laughed softly, but concern remained in her eyes. She stepped away. Emma continued crying. Across the aisle, a businessman closed his laptop with obvious irritation. 2 rows behind them, a woman placed noise-canceling headphones over her ears. Farther back, another passenger shook his head and muttered something under his breath. Nobody was cruel. Nobody raised their voice. Yet the judgment hung in the cabin all the same. Nathan felt every glance, every sigh, every uncomfortable look. And for the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. 6 months earlier, Nathan had managed board meetings involving billions of dollars. He had negotiated international deals. He had solved problems that teams of experts could not solve. Yet he could not figure out how to comfort the tiny girl in his arms. Emma cried again. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. The exhaustion settled over him like a heavy blanket. He remembered the advice people kept giving him. Be patient. Trust yourself. It gets easier. None of those people were here now. None of them could hear what he heard every night. None of them knew how alone he sometimes felt. The plane continued west through the dark evening sky. City lights glittered far below like scattered stars. Inside the cabin, the tension slowly grew. And somewhere near the back of the aircraft, beyond the first-class curtain and far from the attention focused on Nathan Cole, a young woman quietly lifted her eyes from her seat. She had been watching the situation for nearly 40 minutes. Watching the father. Watching the baby. Watching something that nobody else seemed to notice. And as Emma's cries echoed through the cabin once more, the woman realized she might be the only person on that plane who understood what was really wrong. The young woman sitting near the back of the plane was named Alicia Brooks. She had boarded less than 2 hours earlier after finishing a double shift at a family restaurant in Queens. Her feet ached. Her shoulders felt heavy. The neatly folded Waitress apron tucked inside her carry-on still carried the faint scent of coffee and fresh bread. Most passengers would have spent the flight sleeping. Alicia could not. Every time Emma cried, something inside her tightened. Not annoyance. Recognition. She had heard that cry before. Not from this child. From another one years ago. Alicia lowered her eyes and listened carefully. Around her, the mood inside the aircraft continued to change. A middle-aged passenger glanced toward first class and sighed. A man across the aisle shook his head before returning to his tablet. Even the flight attendants looked increasingly concerned. The crying had become the center of the entire flight. It was impossible to ignore. Up front, Nathan shifted Emma into a different position. He whispered softly to her. He rubbed her back. He tried another bottle. Nothing helped. The little girl continued crying against his shoulder. The exhaustion on Nathan's face seemed deeper now. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a father desperately searching for an answer. Alicia watched him carefully. Then she noticed something nobody else seemed to notice. Every time Nathan adjusted the blanket around Emma, The crying became worse. Every time the blanket brushed her cheek, Emma turned away and cried harder. Alicia frowned. Her thoughts drifted backward nearly 15 years. Back to a small apartment in Atlanta. Back to long nights caring for her baby sister while her mother worked late shifts. She remembered learning how babies communicated long before they could speak. Hunger sounded different from fear. Tiredness sounded different from discomfort. This cry reminded her of neither. It sounded like irritation. Constant irritation. Alicia sat forward in her seat. The plane lights had dimmed slightly for the evening portion of the flight. Soft blue cabin lights reflected off overhead compartments. Outside the windows, darkness stretched endlessly across the sky. Yet Alicia's attention remained fixed on the child. A flight attendant passed by pushing a beverage cart. Alicia quietly asked, "Has she been crying since takeoff?" The attendant nodded. Almost the entire flight. Alicia hesitated. "Did anyone check the blanket?" The attendant blinked. "The blanket." Alicia nodded. It might sound strange, but sometimes small things bother babies more than adults realize. The attendant offered a polite smile, the kind people give when they are not completely convinced. "I am sure her father has checked everything." Alicia nodded politely, but uncertainty lingered. She looked toward first class again. Nathan now sat with his head lowered, gently bouncing Emma against his shoulder. The sight made something ache in her chest. Because beneath the expensive clothes and public success, she saw something familiar. Loneliness. Real loneliness. The kind that arrives when everyone expects you to have answers, and you have none. Emma cried again, loud enough that several passengers turned around. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. For a moment, he looked completely defeated. And that was the moment Alicia made her decision. She reached for her seatbelt buckle. Because if she was right, the answer to the entire situation was not in first class. It was not in a bottle. It was not in a toy. It was something so simple that nobody had thought to look for it. The seatbelt sign glowed softly above the aisle as Alicia unfastened her belt and stood. For a brief moment, she questioned herself. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe exhaustion had convinced her she saw something that was not there. Yet every instinct she had developed from years of caring for children told her otherwise. She began walking toward the front of the aircraft. Several passengers looked up as she passed. Most returned to their own thoughts. A few watched curiously. Up ahead, Emma's cries continued to echo through the cabin. Nathan barely noticed Alicia approaching at first. He was too focused on soothing his daughter. His voice had grown hoarse from whispering comforting words. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of fatigue. When Alicia stopped beside his seat, he looked up with tired eyes. For a second, neither of them spoke. "Excuse me," Alicia said gently. "I know this may sound strange, but I think I might be able to help." Nathan blinked. He looked at the young woman standing beside him. Her clothes were simple. Her face carried the exhaustion of someone who had worked a long day. There was nothing about her that suggested expertise. Nothing except the calm confidence in her voice. Before Nathan could answer, Emma cried again, louder than before. Alicia's gaze shifted toward the blanket wrapped around the child. "Has she been uncomfortable since shortly after takeoff?" Nathan frowned. "How did you know that?" Alicia hesitated. "Because every time the blanket touches her face, she reacts." Nathan looked down. He had not noticed. Not once. Over the past hour he had been so overwhelmed by the crying that he had stopped observing the small details. Alicia knelt slightly beside the seat. "May I take a look?" The question hung in the air. A nearby passenger watched openly. A flight attendant paused several rows away. Nathan studied Alicia's face. Normally he would never allow a stranger this close to his daughter. But normal had disappeared somewhere over Pennsylvania. All that remained was a father searching for answers. Slowly he nodded. Alicia carefully examined the blanket. It looked expensive. Soft. New. The kind of luxury baby item that came highly recommended by parenting websites. She gently rubbed the fabric between her fingers. Then she noticed something. Tiny decorative stitching along one edge had begun to fray. The thread was almost invisible. Almost. Alicia touched the loose fibers lightly. Emma immediately turned her head away and whimpered. Alicia's eyes widened slightly. "There," she whispered. Nathan leaned forward. "What is it?" Alicia pointed carefully. "The stitching." Nathan stared at the blanket. The loose fibers seemed insignificant. Yet as Alicia gently folded that section away from Emma's skin, something remarkable happened. The crying softened. Not completely, but noticeably. The change was small enough that some passengers missed it. Nathan did not. He froze. Alicia slowly removed the blanket altogether. Emma continued fussing for several seconds. Then her tiny hands relaxed. The piercing cries became quiet whimpers. Then soft breaths. Then silence. Complete silence. The transformation was so sudden that the cabin seemed stunned. Passengers looked up from books and screens. The businessman across the aisle lowered his laptop. Even the flight attendants exchanged surprised glances. Nathan stared at his daughter in disbelief. Emma blinked sleepily and rested her head against his shoulder. For the first time during the entire flight, she looked peaceful. Nathan looked back at Alicia. Neither of them spoke, because sometimes the most extraordinary moments arrive disguised as the simplest answers. For several long seconds, nobody seemed willing to disturb the silence. The change was so dramatic that the entire cabin felt transformed. The constant tension that had stretched across the flight like an invisible wire suddenly disappeared. Emma rested peacefully against Nathan's shoulder, her tiny fingers curled loosely around the fabric of his shirt. The same passengers who had spent the last hour exchanging frustrated glances now looked forward with quiet amazement. A flight attendant covered her smile with one hand. Another shook her head in disbelief. Nathan remained frozen, afraid that even the smallest movement might break whatever miracle had just occurred. Then he looked at Alicia, really looked at her for the first time. Not as a stranger, not as a passenger, as the person who had accomplished what nobody else had managed to do. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. Alicia smiled modestly. "I did not know for sure." Nathan glanced at the blanket lying beside him. "But you noticed something none of us noticed." Alicia lowered her eyes for a moment. Sometimes when people are overwhelmed, they start looking at the big problem and stop seeing the small details. Nathan let out a tired laugh. The truth of those words hit harder than he expected, because they applied to far more than parenting. For years he had built a career solving enormous problems. Market shifts, corporate crises, international negotiations. Yet tonight he had missed a loose thread irritating his daughter because panic had narrowed his focus. Emma shifted slightly and let out a soft, sleepy sigh. The sound felt almost unreal after so much crying. Several nearby passengers smiled. One older woman across the aisle whispered, "Thank goodness." The mood inside the cabin continued to soften. People returned to their books, their conversations, their movies. The flight finally felt normal again. Nathan carefully adjusted Emma against his shoulder. "Please sit down for a minute," he said. Alicia hesitated. "I should probably go back to my seat." "Please," Nathan repeated. "At least let me thank you." A flight attendant quickly offered Alicia the empty seat beside him. She sat down reluctantly. Nathan studied her face. There was kindness there, but also exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying responsibilities for a very long time. "Do you have children?" he asked. Alicia shook her head. "No." Nathan looked surprised. "Then how did you become so good with babies?" For a moment Alicia stared toward the dark window beside them. The reflection of the cabin lights shimmered across the glass. "Life taught me," she said softly. There was something in her voice that suggested a deeper story. Nathan noticed it immediately. Before he could ask more, Emma's tiny hand reached outward in her sleep. Her fingers wrapped around Alicia's sleeve. The gesture lasted only a second, but everyone who saw it smiled. Even asleep, the child seemed drawn to the woman who had helped her. Alicia looked down and gently touched Emma's hand. Her expression changed, just slightly. A mixture of warmth and sadness passed across her face before disappearing again. Nathan noticed that too, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he suddenly realized this flight was no longer just about a crying baby. Because behind Alicia's calm smile was a story she had not told. A story written in old memories, quiet sacrifices, and a kind of strength that could not be measured by money. And before this plane reached Los Angeles, Nathan Cole was going to learn exactly what that story was. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight crossed the middle of the country. Most passengers had settled into a calmer rhythm now that the crisis seemed over. Soft conversations returned. Screens glowed quietly. The steady hum of the engines filled the spaces where Emma's cries had dominated only minutes earlier. Yet Nathan found himself paying less attention to the peaceful cabin and more attention to the woman sitting beside him. Alicia had not behaved like someone seeking recognition. In fact, she seemed slightly uncomfortable with the attention she had already received. When a flight attendant offered her a complimentary drink as a thank you, she politely declined and asked only for a glass of water. Nathan noticed that. He noticed a lot of things now. The way she spoke gently. The way she checked on Emma without drawing attention to herself. The way she seemed accustomed to putting other people's needs first. You said life taught you, Nathan said quietly after a moment. Alicia smiled faintly. Life teaches everyone eventually. Nathan looked down at his sleeping daughter. I think I am still taking notes. Alicia let out a soft laugh. It was the first time Nathan had seen her truly relax. For a moment, she looked younger than 28. Then her gaze drifted toward the dark cabin window. When I was 13, my mother started working nights, she said. Someone had to take care of my little sister. Nathan listened carefully. So that became you. Alicia nodded. Most days. Her voice carried no bitterness. Only memory. She was 4 years younger than me. She hated thunderstorms. She hated crowded rooms. She hated itchy blankets too. Nathan smiled. That explains how you spotted the problem so quickly. Alicia looked down at her hands. When you spend enough years paying attention to someone, you learn that little things matter. Those words lingered with Nathan. Little things matter. He repeated them silently. Somewhere along the way, he had become a man whose entire career focused on large things. Major deals, major projects, major decisions. Yet the biggest challenge in his life lately had been a 10-month-old girl who needed attention, patience, and understanding. Not strategy, not money, understanding. Emma shifted slightly in her sleep. Her tiny hand still rested against Alicia's sleeve. Nathan watched the scene with quiet amazement. For weeks, maybe months, Emma had struggled to settle comfortably during travel. Pediatricians offered suggestions. Parenting books offered advice. Friends offered opinions. Yet a waitress returning home after a long shift had solved the problem in less than 5 minutes simply because she noticed something everyone else overlooked. The realization humbled him. A few rows ahead, a passenger glanced back and smiled at Alicia. Another gave her a small nod of appreciation. She acknowledged both politely, but seemed eager to avoid becoming the center of attention. Nathan found that unusual. Most people who helped a billionaire would find a way to mention it. Most people would ask questions about his company or his success. Alicia had not asked a single one. Instead, she kept checking on Emma. The child stirred again, opening her eyes briefly before settling back down. Alicia smiled warmly. But as she did, Nathan noticed something else. A flash of sadness hidden behind that smile. It disappeared almost instantly, but he saw it. And suddenly he understood that the story Alicia had shared about her younger sister was not the whole story. There was something more. Something painful. Something she carried quietly. And for reasons he could not explain, he felt certain that before this flight landed in Los Angeles, that hidden piece of her story would change everything. The aircraft cruised smoothly through the night sky, while most of the cabin settled into a quiet calm. Emma remained asleep, her breathing soft and steady, her tiny hand occasionally tightening around Alicia's sleeve before relaxing again. Nathan found himself watching the scene with an emotion he had not felt in months. Relief. Genuine relief. For the first time since boarding the flight, he was not calculating solutions or preparing for another crisis. He was simply sitting beside his daughter, listening to her peaceful breathing. Yet his thoughts kept returning to Alicia. The sadness he had noticed earlier had not disappeared. It lingered behind her smile like a shadow just beyond the light. Eventually Nathan spoke. What happened to your sister? The question was gentle. There was no pressure behind it. Alicia remained quiet for several seconds. The cabin lights reflected softly across the window beside her. Far below, scattered clusters of city lights passed through the darkness. She looked at them before answering. She passed away 8 years ago. Nathan felt his chest tighten. I am sorry. Alicia nodded. Thank you. Her voice remained calm, but memories had already returned to her eyes. She was 16. Nathan looked down at Emma instinctively. The contrast felt impossible. One life just beginning. Another remembered through old photographs and fading memories. Alicia folded her hands together. She was the happiest person I ever knew. She could make people laugh when they forgot how. A small smile touched her lips. She loved music. She loved old movies. She loved collecting things that nobody else thought were valuable. Nathan listened carefully. Like what? Alicia laughed softly. Ticket stubs. Buttons. Pieces of ribbon. Little things. Her smile faded slightly. She taught me that people spend too much time chasing important things and not enough time appreciating meaningful things. The words settled heavily between them. Nathan stared toward the sleeping child in his arms. Over the last year, he had spent thousands of hours building presentations, reviewing reports, and attending meetings. Yet some of his happiest recent memories involved moments no investor would ever care about. Emma learning to recognize his voice. Emma laughing at his silly face. Emma falling asleep against his shoulder. Meaningful things. Alicia continued. After she passed away, I promised myself I would pay attention to people the way she did. Nathan looked at her. What does that mean? Alicia glanced around the cabin. Most people want to be noticed. Very few people take time to notice others. Nathan said nothing, because he knew she was right. Earlier that evening, dozens of passengers had heard Emma crying. Many had reacted. Few had actually observed her. Alicia had. She noticed the blanket, the loose thread, the discomfort, the detail hidden inside the problem. A flight attendant walked by and smiled at Emma sleeping peacefully. Looks like someone finally won the battle. Alicia smiled politely. Nathan shook his head. There was never a battle. The attendant laughed and continued down the aisle. But Nathan kept thinking about his own words. There had never been a battle. Only understanding. Only patience. Only someone willing to look closely enough to see what others missed. Emma stirred slightly and opened her eyes for a moment. She looked directly at Alicia. Then something happened that made Nathan freeze. His daughter smiled. A real smile. Bright. Warm. Trusting. Alicia smiled back. And in that quiet moment 35,000 feet above the ground, Nathan suddenly realized that the woman sitting beside him had given him far more than a peaceful flight. She had reminded him of something he had been losing ever since grief entered his life. The ability to truly see what mattered. The smile Emma gave Alicia lingered long after her eyes drifted closed again. Nathan found himself staring at his daughter in silence. For months he had been searching for signs that things would eventually get easier. Signs that he was not failing her. Signs that somehow, despite everything that had happened, they would both be okay. Yet none of those signs had come from business achievements or financial success. They had arrived in the form of a tired waitress sitting beside him on a late-night flight. The realization humbled him. Outside the window, the darkness stretched endlessly across the country below. Inside the cabin, most passengers had fallen asleep. The atmosphere felt softer now, almost intimate. The stress that had consumed the first half of the journey seemed impossibly far away. Nathan took a slow breath. There is something I have not told many people, he said quietly. Alicia turned toward him. She could hear the weight in his voice immediately. Nathan glanced down at Emma before continuing. My wife passed away 6 months ago. The words hung between them. Simple, honest, painful. Alicia lowered her eyes. Suddenly many things made sense. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the uncertainty. Nathan looked toward the dark window. Everyone assumes I have everything figured out. A faint smile crossed his face. That is the problem with success. People stop asking if you are okay. Alicia listened without interrupting. Nathan continued. After she was gone, everyone focused on me. The company, the interviews, the headlines. He paused. But nobody really talked about Emma. His voice softened. She lost her mother too. Alicia felt her chest tighten. Nathan rubbed his daughter's tiny hand gently. Some days I am afraid she will grow up remembering me as a man who was always working, always distracted, always trying to solve the next problem. Silence filled the space between them. Then Alicia said something so quietly that Nathan almost missed it. Children do not remember perfection. Nathan looked at her. What do they remember? Alicia smiled sadly. They remember presence. The answer landed with surprising force. Presence. Not wealth. Not accomplishments. Presence. Nathan thought about the countless evenings spent answering emails while Emma slept nearby. The business trips. The meetings. The promises that he would slow down after the next quarter. After the next project. After the next deal. There was always another reason to wait. Alicia looked at the sleeping child. Your daughter does not need you to be perfect. Her voice carried the certainty of experience. She just needs to know you are there. Nathan swallowed hard. For the first time in months, someone had spoken directly to the fear he rarely admitted out loud. Not as a billionaire. Not as a public figure. As a father. Emma shifted slightly and nestled closer against him. Nathan felt emotion rise unexpectedly in his chest. The cabin remained quiet. The engines hummed steadily. Somewhere in the darkness below, entire cities slept. Yet 35,000 feet above the ground, a conversation between two strangers was quietly changing the direction of a man's life. And as Nathan looked at his daughter sleeping peacefully in his arms, he realized that Alicia had already given him a gift far greater than solving a problem on a flight. She had helped him understand what kind of father he still had time to become. The conversation lingered in Nathan's mind long after the words were spoken. Presence. The idea seemed almost too simple, yet it carried more weight than any business lesson he had learned in years. He sat quietly for several minutes, watching Emma sleep while the plane continued westward through the darkness. Around them, most passengers remained asleep. A few reading lights glowed softly above scattered seats. The cabin had become a world of whispers, dim lights, and quiet reflection. Nathan glanced toward Alicia. She had finally relaxed into her seat, though the exhaustion of her long day was impossible to miss. He wondered how many people passed her every day without ever learning anything about her. How many people saw only a uniform and never the person wearing it? The thought bothered him. What happens when we land? He asked. Alicia smiled faintly. I take a bus home. Nathan looked surprised. At this hour? She nodded. It is cheaper. Nathan stared at her for a moment. The contrast between their lives felt impossible to ignore. He had spent years flying private whenever his schedule allowed. He had forgotten what it meant to worry about the cost of transportation. Yet Alicia spoke about it as casually as discussing the weather. And tomorrow? He asked. Another shift, she replied. Then another one after that. There was no complaint in her voice. No bitterness. Just reality. Nathan found that remarkable. Many people with far more complained constantly. Alicia seemed grateful for things most people overlooked. The realization stayed with him. A little later, one of the flight attendants approached quietly. Mr. Cole, she said softly, we should begin preparing for descent in about 40 minutes. Nathan nodded. The attendant smiled toward Emma sleeping peacefully. She looks much happier now. Nathan followed her gaze. She does. The attendant glanced toward Alicia. You helped a lot of people on this flight tonight. Alicia laughed softly. I only helped one baby. The attendant smiled. Sometimes that is the same thing. After she left, Nathan thought about those words. The flight had changed because one person decided to care. One person noticed a detail. One person acted. Not because she expected recognition. Because she believed helping mattered. As Los Angeles drew closer, the first hints of city lights began appearing below the clouds. Golden clusters stretched across the darkness like rivers of stars. Passengers slowly woke and gathered their belongings. The quiet atmosphere shifted again as the journey neared its end. Emma opened her eyes and looked around curiously. Then she saw Alicia. Instantly, a smile spread across her face. The little girl reached both hands toward her. Alicia laughed and gently touched her fingers. Several nearby passengers noticed and smiled. Even strangers who had spent the first half of the flight frustrated by the crying now seemed touched by the connection. Nathan watched the scene carefully. Then he made a decision. It was not a business decision. It was not a financial decision. It was something far more personal. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small card. Not a corporate card. Not a promotional card. His direct personal contact information. He looked at Alicia and said, When we land, there is something I would like to ask you. And I hope you will at least hear me out. Alicia looked confused. Nathan smiled slightly. For the first time in a very long time, the future felt a little brighter. And somehow, he knew that this flight was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The wheels touched the runway with a gentle vibration that rolled through the aircraft. Outside the windows, Los Angeles shimmered beneath the night sky, a sea of lights stretching toward the horizon. Around the cabin, passengers gathered bags, switched on phones, and prepared to continue their lives. Yet something felt different. The flight that had begun with tension and frustration was ending with a quiet sense of gratitude. Emma sat awake in Nathan's arms, alert and cheerful. Every few moments she looked toward Alicia and smiled. It was the same smile that had appeared earlier, warm and trusting, as though she had already decided that Alicia was a friend. Nathan watched the interaction and felt something loosen inside his chest. For months he had carried grief like invisible luggage. Heavy, constant, impossible to set down. Tonight, for the first time, the weight felt lighter. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Nathan reached into his jacket and handed Alicia the card he had mentioned earlier. She accepted it politely, but looked uncertain. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but helping your daughter did not require a reward." Nathan smiled. "I know." The sincerity in his voice made her pause. "This is not about rewarding you." He glanced at Emma. "This is about thanking someone who reminded me what matters." The cabin door finally opened. Passengers began standing and moving toward the aisle. Several people who had witnessed the events of the flight stopped to thank Alicia personally. An older couple wished her well. A businessman who had spent the first hour visibly irritated offered an embarrassed smile and said, "You taught all of us something tonight." Alicia thanked them quietly. She never seemed comfortable being the center of attention. Eventually, they stepped into the terminal. Bright airport lights reflected across polished floors. Travelers hurried in every direction. Announcements echoed from distant speakers. The ordinary rush of life surrounded them once again. Nathan adjusted Emma on his shoulder and turned toward Alicia. "Would you do me one favor?" Alicia nodded cautiously. "Call me sometime." She looked surprised. Nathan continued before she could answer. "Not because of my company. Not because of business. Because I think Emma would like to see her friend again." Alicia laughed softly. Emma immediately reached toward her. The gesture made all three of them smile. Then Alicia said something Nathan would remember for the rest of his life. "Your daughter does not need a billionaire." Nathan looked at her. "She needs her father." The airport seemed to fade around him. Those words struck deeper than any compliment ever could. Because they were true. Completely true. Nathan looked down at Emma. She rested her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes again, perfectly content. In that moment, he understood what months of success, recognition, and achievement had failed to teach him. Wealth could provide comfort. Success could provide opportunity. Influence could open doors. But none of those things could replace being present for the people who loved you. Alicia smiled and picked up her bag. Then she disappeared into the crowd like any other traveler. No grand speech. No celebration. No expectation of anything in return. Just quiet kindness, the same way she had lived her life all along. Nathan watched until she was gone. Years later, he would still tell people about that flight. Not because a waitress stopped a baby from crying, but because a stranger reminded him that the most important things in life are usually the things money cannot buy. Emma would grow up surrounded by opportunity, but her father never forgot the lesson that changed him. Greatness is not measured by what you earn. It is measured by how deeply you care. And sometimes the person who changes your life is the one the world barely notices until the moment they choose to help.